on the evening of November 12th, 1959. All seemed normal. At the terminal yard of Jersey Central Railroad, located in, Jersey City. Everything's Jersey around here. The men were working the late shift. Things were quiet that evening. But, towerman Joe Helinski was surprised to notice that the bell that warned of a train approaching the tower that he worked in was sounding. But there was no train scheduled to be approaching. No one had said anything about that. He didn't panic, of course. He thought maybe somebody was doing something stupid or whatever it might be. And he tried to look at his model board to see what the heck was going on. No tracks were lit, at least at first, so he thought maybe the bell was just malfunctioning. But then, a white bulb did illuminate on yard track 9. That was one of the busier lines in the yard, where the big freight trains tended to leave and enter the main line. The HY Tower, where Helinski was, stands at that junction, and most of his job consisted of switching the freights in and out of the yard. But now he was alarmed because, again, nothing should have been moving at that point. All the scheduled trains had been running on time with the exception of one, the New York Clocker, which was 30 minutes late. As a result, nothing else was due to pass that tower for at least that amount of time. But the light was on, the bell was ringing, something was moving. So Helinski decided to step outside and figure out, what the heck was happening. But it was dark, and oddly, alarmingly, he couldn't actually see anything. That was weird on its own, because if there was a locomotive out there, some kind of train, it would have its running lights on. Again, it was night, and many of these locomotives had those lights on during the day too, for extra visibility. So not only was something apparently moving out there, but whatever it was, couldn't be readily seen. And though his eyes didn't tell him what he needed to know, his ears did. As the locomotive approached, Helinski could hear it, and he'd been working on the railroad long enough to know what a diesel sounded like at full power. As the engine approached, he realized she was going much too fast, headed towards the derailer, which was in place specifically to prevent runaways from leaving the yard without, someone letting them do that. He assumed what he might have here is an accident, a locomotive thrown off the rails, but at least she wouldn't get on the main line. However, Helinski was deeply horrified to see that while the locomotive did hit the derailer, she proceeded to go right over it, bouncing up into the air on one side, but then landing squarely right back down on the tracks. And she kept going. Then she pushed through the switches and freed herself onto the main line, track number 3. Helinski immediately got on the phone and ordered a hold on track number 3. But there were a lot of trains on the main line, and even with a hold in place, this runaway was hardly going to stop, and would likely result in some serious damage if they didn't figure out what the heck to do about it. There was also much confusion when it came to this because no one knew who was in the engine. Who was doing this? Was someone going crazy? Was it a trespasser? A hijacker? What was happening? Well, they didn't really have time to figure that out. All they knew right now is they had an unauthorized locomotive on the main line, and she was completely out of control. The locomotive in question, by the way, was number 1706. It's diesel electric, mostly designed for yard work, but could handle the main line. She was fairly powerful for a yard switcher, 1600 horsepower, and weighed about, 123 tons, so... Okay, this is a problem! When Joe called for the hold, it was heard all over the place, including 2 miles away by his own brother, the assistant chief dispatcher, Frank Helinski. Frank got on the phone with Joe to see why he had called for the hold, and Joe told him, we got a runaway, and I have no idea who's on it or what's going on, but she's headed west against traffic. And the most immediate problem was that late express, the Clocker. If that express had been on time, she wasn't. She'd already be in the terminal, and she'd be a non-factor. The runaway was on track 3, the clocker was on track 1. They weren't on the same line. However, due to the way the station was laid out, if the clocker decided to, say, get into the station, like normal, and her passengers started to depart, they would have to cross over the number 3 line as the runaway barreled through. You can kind of see how this could turn horrific pretty quickly based on that alone. So Frank called Bayon Tower to try to get the clocker halted before she got to the station. And he also began work to figure out how to even stop the runaway to begin with. His first thought was to attempt to reroute her, but that wasn't really much of an option. Every track they had available was blocked by trains, but fortunately they were able to get the clocker stopped. And the runaway passed through the station, as well as going by the clocker, without causing any harm. But now she was headed towards a head-on collision, right into a freight train number 692. And of course, in that situation, stopping 692 would be a little irrelevant, because, well, they'd still be on the same track. The runaway would hit them, which would be bad. So they had to get the runaway off somewhere. At first he was thinking maybe he could switch her to a different part of the main line, as he had 4 tracks to work with. 1, 2, 3, and 4. She was on 3, and he could move her over to 1, but there was a passenger train coming that way, number 628, so that was an even worse idea. And even if he moved her over to the other 2 tracks, well, there were trains everywhere. Due to her speed, she was going to rear end any one of them. Basically, they had to get her off the main line, period. Thus, the only real option was a branch line, the Perth Amboy branch. But that on its own had its various risks. There were trains on the branch, too. But if he could get her onto track 2 of the branch line, well, there would be trains in the way, but they were pretty far ahead of her. They'd have more time to work with. He could at least delay an accident while they figured out what the heck to do about this. Someone also suggested perhaps ditching her into a factory siding, but that was decided that was a really friggin' bad idea, because A, she could run into something like explosive, and that would be bad. Also, they really didn't know why she was running away. There was the thought that maybe the crew was on board, but were under some kind of medical distress, or being held hostage, or something. They just didn't know, and they were trying to stop the runaway without breaking anything or killing anyone, so doing anything that might toss her off the track wasn't really something they wanted to do, while they still thought they might be able to come up with another option. And they did manage to get 1706 onto track 2 of the Perth Amboy branch. The result is that they gave themselves about 30 minutes before she was at risk of hitting another train, which was enough time for them to actually think about the situation. Frank would then get a hold of the division superintendent, named Joseph Gallupo, who was at home. He wasn't on shift. Frank told him what was going on, which Joseph was of course deeply alarmed to hear, and Frank again mentioned the idea of ditching her in a siding. He didn't like it, but Gallupo was his boss, so he thought he'd give him every option available. Gallupo also said, no, don't actually do that, because a lot of those sightings were factory sightings, and the factories had people in them, but also a lot of them were working with gasoline, chemicals, and other explosive things. It was not a good idea to just throw a runaway locomotive into any of them, so that idea was thrown out. There was also the possibility of the drawbridge, the open Raritan River drawbridge. Someone suggested, what if they leave the drawbridge open on purpose and just throw her in the river? However, once again, that was vetoed by Gallupo, because on that river, barges traveled, which again have people, and a lot of those barges carry propane for shipment, which, boom, like, no, we're not throwing her off the rails. We have to stop her, you guys. Someone give me an idea that doesn't involve possibly blowing something up. And eventually Gallupo did come up with something. He told Frank to call ahead and tell the other trains on the line what was coming. The plan here was actually pretty much the exact same thing that CSX did with the Crazy 8 incident, which is more recent and we've talked about it before. Gallupo's plan was to get a locomotive ahead of her, match her speed, and slow down before coupling up and bringing her to a halt. They also had a chase locomotive for this purpose to possibly catch up with her and effectively do the same thing, just on the other side. Either way, they could, in theory, bring the engine to a halt without breaking anything. But this was not an easy thing to do, and came with its own risks, but it seemed like the best option. Frank Kalinsky's branch dispatcher, Jill Snell, was also on the phone and got a hold of someone in the Barber Drill yards. They had an available engine that could get on the line pretty quick, and so she and her crew were sent out to chase the runaway. And they were given strict orders to ignore the signals. Forget it, just don't worry about it. Catch up to 1706. But as far as the engine that was going to be in front of 1706, that duty would fall to 1506. And her crew, engineer Chet Goodmanson, his fireman Harold Johns, as well as the brakeman on duty, Leo Barry. They were pulling what was called Road Run 3, a 41-car freight train, when they were stopped just before the drawbridge and asked to get on their phone. Goodmanson took the call and was informed about the runaway. He was told very clearly, you have absolutely no time, you have to get out in front of this thing and slow it down. Good luck with that. And that was pretty much the extent of the conversation. It was great. Now, Goodmanson was a very experienced railwayman. He'd been on the rails a long time, but he'd never run into a situation quite like this. Regardless, he was gonna do his job, or at least his best. He took 1506 slowly down the straight track at South Amboy, as he was instructed, and was waiting for the runaway. Though, one key bit of information that nobody thought to inform him of, that they probably should have, was that, hey, she's running dark, because he and the rest of the crew were looking for a headlight, and there wasn't one. And that's deeply relevant. Also, on that part of the line, there was a tunnel, which the runaway was going to be coming through. So it was dark, and there was a tunnel. Like, really, this engine was about to sneak up on them in a way that no other diesel engine could possibly hope to achieve. But what about the chase engine, the one out of Barber Drill? Well, that was 1504, but she was having her own issues. See, 1504 was equipped with some pretty modern equipment. Namely, automatic train control, which was designed to slow her down if she approached a red signal and the engineer didn't react, and that could be overridden, but not before she started braking. So every time she hit a red signal, she lost a lot of speed, and this made it tremendously difficult for 1504 to actually chase down 1706. 1706 was getting away with this because she didn't have ATC installed. Just over the bridge, 1706 was switched over to track 2 on the branch, and the crew of 1506 waited patiently, with some sinking dread, for this thing to finally come into view. Someone had the bright idea of actually shining a light into the tunnel to try to get some extra visibility in there, which was a great thought because it actually allowed them to see the engine before she got way too close. They spotted her as she was about halfway through the tunnel, and at that point, Goodmanson threw 1506, well, not into full throttle. You'd think he'd gun it, but he really couldn't. You don't really do that with diesel locomotives, especially older ones. You have to ease them into full throttle. Even putting her to half immediately was a big risk, but he got her up to speed as quickly as reasonably possible, but they were cutting it close. The runaway was moving about 47 miles per hour, so they'd have to get up to at least that, ideally faster to get some space between them so they could slow down and couple to her safely. Now, the problem was that 1506 wasn't actually as powerful as 1706. 1506 was a 1500 horsepower, as well as being a lighter build in general. By 11 p.m., they reached 60 miles per hour, and thought they might have enough space to actually pull this off, so they started slowing down. But they slowed down a bit too much. The runaway did not care that they were in the way, and slammed into them, jostling both locomotives around and almost knocking 1506 off the track entirely. It didn't take long for Goodmanson to realize that stopping 1706 with just 1506's brakes was probably not going to work, so instead he simply had Johns jump over and get into 1706's cab himself to shut her off. But even that was relatively difficult because not only were things shaking and rattling, but the doors on 1706 had been thrown open by the impact, so they were in the way. But he was able to get there, and was stunned to find that there was no one in that cab. Not a soul. Everything was set up for full running, but there was no one at the controls. Regardless, he turned 1706 off, and she finally slowed down and came to a halt. Johns would jump off 1706 and step behind her to flag down the other locomotive they knew was coming to chase, so they wouldn't, slam into them. 1504 and her crew would see him and also stop. The dire situation was over. But the investigation that followed only raised more questions. The crew assigned to 1706 wasn't on duty, nor were they implicated in the incident because they both had alibis. They were at home. At the time, 1706 was parked, with her engine idling awaiting her new crew. To date, it's actually a long-standing mystery. As far as my research shows, we still don't know who the heck turned 1706 on that night. Who sent her off down the line? The most likely explanation is that it was some act of sabotage. Someone trespassed and did that. But it may not have even been a trespasser. It might have even been a disgruntled employee. But the actual perpetrator behind the incident has never been determined. And it's somewhat more obscure, overshadowed by the more recent Crazy 8's incident. It's still a wild story that fortunately ended with no horrific consequences. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.